Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Morton Blackwell, president of the Leadership Institute, and it is now my pleasure to welcome you to this, the September Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. We live in interesting times. Next year, the Republican National Convention will be, for the first time in history, in New York City. And there are symbolic reasons why it might make sense to have a Republican convention in New York City. And the fact is that New York State has a Republican governor, New York City has a Republican mayor. And so it might make sense in a certain way, but as usual, this morning's newspaper brings something very interesting. The Washington Times this morning has an article entitled "Leftists Target Republican Convention," and it seems that as the newspaper says, the motley Manhattan population of liberals, feminists, performance artists, environmentalists, and self-styled anarchists, who oppose, they're sort of anti-architects, I guess, blow them up rather than build them, who oppose the Bush administration are, for one reason or another, already in full cry, and they have actually formed a coalition, and I am not kidding you, I'm not making this up, to disrupt the Republican National Convention, which will be held a year from now in New York City. The organizations involved include, says the paper, among others, the Female Species Collective, the Socialist Party USA, North Brooklyn Greens, Not in Our Name, Electronic Disturbance Theater, ACT UP, Food Not Bombs, and my favorite, the Mad Anarchist Bakers League. It is amusing, and we can laugh at it, but I think that the left has demonstrated a much refined ability to take over the streets. And my guess is it can be pretty tough at that. The Republican National Convention some years ago was held in Dallas, Texas. And the hotel where I stayed overlooked the area where the authorities of Dallas, Texas, who were probably more effective in certain ways than the authorities in New York State or New York City are likely to be, had decreed that the protesters at the Republican National Convention in Dallas were going to have to sleep and camp out. They always needed places to camp out. The hotels are full of Republicans. And they had to sleep out and camp out in the nearby riverbed there, which was a great meadow down by the river. Now, this was, as you can imagine, in the heat of the summertime. In the riverbed, there were probably several 100,000, if not millions, of insects known as mosquitoes. And the temperature was incredibly hot and humid. And Helen and I looked out the window the first day, and the whole meadow was filled with brightly colored tents and sleeping bags. After the first night, the number was reduced to about by half, and by half again on the second night. And by the end of the convention, I think that the leftist radicals concluded that the riverbed was not where they wished to spend the night, and they were virtually all gone. But look forward to trouble next year, and the left is already organizing. In 2003, to date, the Leadership Institute has trained 2,533 students in 97 schools. We have placed 35 job seekers directly through our employment placement service. You have in front of you our 2003 schedule, the calendar of schools. Please take a moment to review it and consider attending one of our programs or recommending some of these programs to people whom you know. Now I present to you Hugh McNichol, who will offer an invocation and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Hugh is now the Direct Marketing Manager at the Leadership Institute and manages our direct mail fundraising program. Before coming on board with the Institute last year, Hugh put pen to paper to raise funds and mobilize conservatives for Richard Viguerie, the College Republican National Committee, Mark Cole for delegate, the Persecution Project, and other commercial and political clients. Hugh relishes fighting for conservative candidates and has worked in campaigns in Virginia, Texas, Ohio, and Vermont. He's particularly pleased that the Virginia State Senate race he managed in 1999, a long shot by anybody's standards, ended up by spooking a liberal Republican incumbent so badly that the incumbent sought and embraced the Democrats' endorsement. Hugh bet the incumbent's campaign manager that his grassroots candidate would win at least 25% of the vote. Although outspent almost 6-1, Hugh's candidate won 38% of the vote, but Hugh is still waiting for the wager to veer. Hugh is also a veteran. He served as a U.S. Army Ranger, among other infantry and intelligence assignments. He was greatly grateful to his father and mother for becoming Americans and for raising him right. He is fiercely proud that his father killed Nazis in World War II and that his mother fled Cuba before the communist coup. He was a graduate of St. Mary's University, where he graduated cum laude with his bachelor's degree in English. For invocation and Pledge of Allegiance, Hugh McNichol.
Good morning. Please join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we praise and worship you. We thank you for the gift of another day. Thank you for the gifts of life and liberty and for making them worth fighting for. We ask your blessing on this gathering here through Christ our Lord. Amen. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, Hugh. And now I'm going to present to you Chris Steele. He'll give an overall update from the Programs Department. Chris is currently Director of Schools here at the Leadership Institute, where he oversees all aspects of school setup and faculty recruitment for many of the Institute's training programs. He is the founder and editor of the College Briefing, a weekly email digest that exposes leftists in college newspapers in their own words. That's available if you want to look at it at www.collegebriefing.org. In 2002, Chris developed the Institute's Campus Elections Workshop, which provides specialized training to conservative college students seeking elective positions inside student government. Chris interned at the office of Representative Dick Armey of Texas, where his emphasis was on the flat tax. Chris founded the Rutherford Junior Council, an organization dedicated to get youth involved in local politics while gaining an understanding of the workings of local government. Recently, Chris spoke at the Ontario Conservative Party's Conservative Leadership Foundation and Youth Alliance. Chris has been involved in all aspects of campaigns, from the local level to the congressional level. He is a graduate of Rutgers University with degrees in political science and history. Chris Steele.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Walt Disney was once asked, "What business are you in?" Now you see, Walt could have answered that question in many ways. He could have said, I'm in the mouse business. I'm in animation. I'm in the amusement park business. He could have even said cryogenics. He could have said any number of things. But he didn't say any of those things, ladies and gentlemen. What he said was, I'm in the happiness business. Happiness business. When many people ask me, from back home in New Jersey or from wherever, what do you do at Leadership Institute? Sometimes it's a little hard to explain. So I tell them one thing, that I am, and we all here, are in the business of victory. For us, all here gathered today, victory means many things to many people who walk through these doors here. A student can come here, and victory for them is getting up in front of 50 people and giving a 5-minute speech. That's victory. For them, victory could be moving down to this area of the country and getting a job on Capitol Hill. That's victory. Victory could be going to our public relations school and learning the elusive art of staying on message. That's victory. And if you'll permit me, I have some examples of recent victories that our students have gained through our schools. I just mentioned our public relations school. We had it a few weeks back. One of our students works with Judge Roy Moore. I'm sure we've all read the newspapers and know who that is. And regardless of your stand on that issue or how it turned out, this is what our student did. They came to our school on a Monday, and they learned how to stay on message. One of our tools that we teach is called the Leesburg Grid. How to stay on message. Really forces you to do that. By Tuesday, that was being used in Alabama. Now, say whatever you want about what happened, but they stayed on message. And if in a small part to that, that was because of our program here, well, I think that's a huge victory. It also shows that our programs here, we don't teach theory. We don't teach theory. We teach practical techniques that you can use the next day, that night. She could have gotten on a cell phone that evening after hearing that speech and gotten on the phone to Alabama and said, this is what we got to do. I need you to draw a cross like this, and these are these 4 quadrants, and this is how we're going to stay on message. And just explain to them the technique. That issue may not have turned out the way some people would have liked it, but that's a victory. Getting a public official to stay on message is a victory. Another student at that same school, and thank the Lord, this is really great timing, ladies and gentlemen, called me last night. That's great timing. Called me last night and said they attended the public relations school, loved it, went on and on and on. They're starting their own nonprofit. It's been going for a year. They came to the PR school to find out how to get their message out, how to be more effective with it. And then they asked me a question at the school. They said, can you tell me how I can be more effective in running a nonprofit? And I told her, absolutely not. I haven't the first idea about how to run a nonprofit. I don't. But I know who does. And I went upstairs and I grabbed one of Morton's writings, the Conservative Organizational Entrepreneur. And I said, here's your homework. Read this. And did she? And she called me up last night, ranting, raving, this is everything I wanted to, this is perfect, this is everything I wanted to have in a writing and anything to help me. Ladies and gentlemen, that's clearly a victory. And for the PR school and for other schools, these are just the ones we hear about. There are many victories that are learned, that are applied out there, outside the Beltway, by many of our students. And sometimes we hear about them, sometimes we don't. And the victories they may think are too small to tell us about. But I think that all those victories are still victories nonetheless. Besides our core schools that happen here all the time, we can tailor specialized training to groups that come here. And in this very room, we had a group called the American Association of Christian Schools, high school group. And many of them thought, great, I want a free trip to Washington. All right, fair enough. They didn't care one way or another about politics or the process or anything. And we had them run a campaign for president. And we break all the 50 students or 60 students down into small campaigns. And by the change that they had from a Monday to Friday when they were running, when we had our voters come down here, they're getting mobbed. People were being solicited for votes, help. This whole place had signs all over it for candidates, all over this place. You see, we cleaned the mess up real nice. And then they all discovered that, hey, wait a second. I'm a young conservative. Wow. Now, ladies and gentlemen, making sure that 50 high school students are not going to go the other way, well, that's a big victory in and of itself. And making sure that those kids were inspired and activated and ready to go back to their high schools and then ultimately their college campuses, inspired in small part because of us. And just being here and understanding, that's a huge victory. Making young conservatives realize that they're young conservatives. We've had a worldwide influence. Last year in this room, we had a campaign leadership school. 65 students were trained. 20 of those students were from Canada. They have nothing close to what the Leadership Institute can provide in Canada. Nothing. And they came down here. We had students drive from British Columbia. That's 30 hours to Ottawa, and then you make a right. And then it's another 10 hours. And they brought our youngest graduate, a 9-month-old, who sat in that back of the room there, didn't make a peep, and hopefully through osmosis is ready to be a very effective campaigner when they can walk. But our influence goes even across the ocean. Months ago, Morton met with some people, and I met with them about doing Leadership Institute training in Poland. And Poland's very interesting, of course, as we all know. Poland was not free for a very long time. Through my entire lifetime, through a significant portion of my lifetime, they were not a free society to do anything. There was one party, things were pretty well decided, that kind of, makes it a lot easier to know who you're going to vote for, right? But they still had no freedom nonetheless. We all know this. And within a decade, about 15 years ago, they finally get their independence. Finally, communism falls. And now they come to us and say, we want to be sure that we're effective. How can we keep this freedom that we've had? How can we maintain ourselves through the process? Can you train us in being effective in campaigns? Essentially, not making any mistakes that we could have made and learned from over the years. We can start them off with good habits. And we sent a team of our finest lecturers over to Poland, over to Krakow, to train 35 students. And those students now are so much more effective than they could have been, and are so much more effective to make sure that their message of having democracy is going to be protected. Because those 35 people can go out and start think tanks, and those 35 people can run campaigns, and those 35 people can be involved in the government, involved in the process, and their influence can keep multiplying, and they can share techniques that they've learned through our training to other people. Ladies and gentlemen, of all I talked about today, I think that's most obviously a huge victory that we all here have played a part in. And just to clarify one point, when I say we, I don't just mean people who work within these walls or run training schools here. Everybody here, staff, friends, supporters, most importantly our donors, are the ones that make this happen. And people who come to the training schools here, people who we've gone to around the country and now around the world, are much better off because of what we've done. So ladies and gentlemen, obviously all the victories I speak of were made possible through the generosity of our donors. Without your support, this world would be in a heap of trouble. But because of your support, we all are changing lives and making sure that we have more victories after victories after victories. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. A nice summary. I do want to point out one thing. We do a fair amount of training of foreigners. We have open admissions in our schools here, and lots of foreigners come to our schools here. And we do occasionally do training abroad, but our policy is that the training that we do abroad is funded by the people in the host countries. We don't spend Leadership Institute donors' contributions to go abroad to do training. The activity in Poland was funded by the Polish conservative groups that wanted us there, and they provide the airfare, the food and lodging when we go somewhere else. And that we can do a lot of it, and the people whom we send are our faculty at the Leadership Institute, but our faculty are overwhelmingly volunteer faculty, so they're happy to go, and it's sort of exciting to go abroad. This has been our policy for a long time, that we don't spend Institute money, but we will go over and do training. And I made an offer to Dario Paya, who interned here a decade ago, that we would do all the training that he wanted in Chile and come down as often as he wanted, provided that they pay airfare and food and lodging for me and the faculty, staff or volunteer faculty. And you always have to be careful when you make commitments, because I have now been to Chile 17 times. Now, it is my pleasure to call Hugh back up here to introduce the extraordinary featured speaker that we have today, who is one of truly the great men of our time. And Hugh, come up and introduce our speaker.
It's common when doing an introduction to read off the facts and figures from the speaker's bio, which I am not going to do. I don't know Major General Singlaub. I do know of him because I was a soldier once. When young infantrymen dream, they often dream of proving themselves under fire. Some even dare to wonder if one day they could fill the boots of men like Major Dick Meadows, Sergeant First Class Jerry Shriver, Master Sergeant Gary Gordon, and Sergeant First Class Randall Shugart. Some of you may recognize those names. Some grunts would even, Army nickname for infantrymen, would even dare to dream that they might fill the boots of our guest speaker this morning. All these men I've named, including General Singlaub, are legends within the hallowed halls of Army Special Operations. In the words of former Secretary of the Army John Marsh, such men are committed, dedicated, anonymous. They belong to a tiny fraternity whose common bond is uncommon valor. General Singlaub has fought alongside and commanded some of the finest fighting men to ever serve under the American flag, including the Office of Strategic Services in World War II, which was the forerunner of the CIA, and Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observation Group. I'll close here with a fitting quote from George Orwell. "We sleep safe in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to visit violence on those who would do us harm." General Singlaub has invested 35 years in uniform doing that very thing, serving America by protecting us. It is a great honor to introduce him. Please welcome Major General John Singlaub. General.
Did you turn this on? This is pretty high tech, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to handle it, but I'll try. I thank you very much for that introduction coming from a ranger. I particularly appreciate that. The subject that I'm to cover this morning is, does North Korea deserve being on the axis of evil hit parade? Now, I could probably answer that without anyone's disappointment by saying yes and then sitting down. But because I have a philosophy that while men may forget, but nations cannot afford to forget the lessons of the past. So I would like to discuss some of the history of Korea and how we got to the situation that we're in now before I talk about the current activities that have been taking place in Beijing and in other capitals. The history of Korea in the 20th century is of particular significance. Korea has for centuries been dominated by China, and until the Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 95, Japan occasionally had incursions there, but in fact Korea, a small country, small peninsula, but it is at the vortex of the Pacific powers. It is in Korea where China has a common border, Russia has a common border. In the Northeast, that sometimes is surprising to some of the people. I'll put a map of Korea up here so that you can perhaps get a better feel for this, even if it is not a perfect visual aid for this purpose. Japan has had an island called Tsushima, which is only 21 miles off the south coast of Korea. And of course, the United States has had a great deal of interest and activity in that part of the world, starting back in the 1800s. But I said that Korea has been dominated by China for many years. But when the Japanese defeated some of the major Chinese, now these were the imperial Chinese dynasties that occupied Beijing. Some of them had come from Mongolia, as you know. Others from the Qing dynasty came out of Manchuria. They were referred to as the Manchus. But in 1904, the Japanese challenged the Russians, who had been working in the area to the north of Korea, in what is known as Manchuria. and had occupied a port of Dairen and Port Arthur on the Guangdong Peninsula, which is to the west of Korea and not shown on this map. In the conduct of the operations by the Japanese, which were well done, Japan used Korea as a way of getting to the rear of the Russian bases in Port Arthur. They disregarded any sovereignty of Korea, marched up, crossed the Yalu into Manchuria, and conducted their operations, attacking that port from the shore side rather than by sea, as their defenses were pointing toward the sea, a situation that has caused others to lose battles and wars. That war, by the way, was a small part of our total history, but there were nearly 1 million men involved in those battles between the Japanese, the Russians, and the Chinese. One of the biggest naval battles took place in the Tsushima Straits, between the mainland of Korea and this island of Tsushima, Japanese island of Tsushima, and the Japanese Navy totally dispersed the Russian fleet to include the Baltic fleet that was ordered by the Tsar to move out and take part in this operation. But the Japanese were superior in terms of seamanship, and they had very modern ships to sail in. By 1910, Korea was just a colony of Japan and was so declared to the world, and no one challenged it. By 1932, Japan annexed Manchuria. They created the Mukden Incident in September of 1932 and very quickly pushed the Chinese out and took over, so that an awful lot of Asia was under Japanese control at the start of World War II. From 1910 to 1945, when the end of World War II defeated Japan and released the colony of Korea, Korea was completely dominated by the Japanese. The Koreans were forced to have Japanese names. The official language of Korea was Japanese. You got a degree, and it was in Japanese language. During World War II, the USSR finally entered that war against Japan on the day that the second atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, on the 9th of August 1945. Just a week later, the emperor had indicated a willingness to surrender. That was not fully accepted by the military leadership in Japan, which caused some of us difficulties in the field. That may be a separate subject. But at that time, I had shifted from operations in Europe, unconventional warfare operations with the French resistance, to China. And I had a mission into what we call Vietnam Now, which was canceled, and I was asked if I would volunteer to take a rescue mission into Hainan Island to rescue some Allied POWs. And I was assured by the headquarters in Kunming that the Japanese were going to surrender. Well, I took that at face value, but I was somewhat surprised when I parachuted in with 8 other guys and found that nobody had told the Japanese on Hainan Island that the war was over. And so I had a little stressful time for a couple of days before we straightened out who was in charge. The Russians entered Manchuria in that time frame, and very shortly they were pushing down through the Japanese forces and headed into North Korea by crossing the Yalu River at Andong. The Allied forces recognized that there was a need for coordination, and so they decided to draw a line on the map of Korea at the 38th parallel, which I don't know if you can see it, I can barely see it. It's a line that crosses Korea on this side of this DMZ, on the north side. Over here it's south of the DMZ. That was a line that was established for coordination. The Russians would be in charge of disarming and repatriating the Japanese north of that line, while the U.S. would do the same south of that line. The USSR, the troops of the USSR, were so surprised when they found that the conditions of the average citizen in Manchuria and later in Korea were much better than they were in their hometowns in the Soviet Union. That prompted them to take advantage of their superior position, and they commenced first unilateral disarming of and looting of the population, and later it was a well-organized operation conducted by the Soviet armed forces to strip Manchuria and North Korea of all of the worthwhile factories, power generators, anything that they thought that they could use. And as the Soviets withdrew from Mukden, Manchuria, when I arrived there in early '46, the tanks would have sofas strapped on the top of them. Trucks were filled with furniture and anything that they could pick up. The Soviet soldiers had 2 or 3 watches on each wrist, which they had taken off of Japanese. The Soviets took many of the Japanese with them, by the way, when they conducted this looting, which was done very, very professionally. It looked as if they had had practice in this sort of thing. And they called it reparations. This was reparations from their former enemy, which had been an enemy for only less than a week. The U.S. forces made an effort to remove all of the Japanese restrictions from the South Koreans and to assist in selecting a leader. And there was a strong leader who had been in exile in China, in Shanghai, Ri Singman. Singman Ri, he used the name. And he was took over and was appointed first as the leader, and later was elected the president of the Republic of Korea in the south. In the north, the Soviets took complete charge of running things and brought in a man who had been a dedicated communist called Kim Il-sung, who had been with the Soviets for many, many years and has assisted in forming a Korean division that fought with the Soviets, first presumably against the Japanese. Then that same division was given to Mao Zedong, who in the 40s, who used it to fight against the Chinese nationalist forces in Manchuria. And then that same division of Koreans was transferred to Kim Il-sung, and that same division participated in the invasion of South Korea in 1950. You can see how the Soviets, now we call them the Russians, and the Japanese have been deeply involved in the activities in Korea. The Soviets were really concentrating on developing a communist philosophy, a communist economic system, centralized planning, all the rest, and concentrated on building an offensive military force, a force equipped with tanks, Russian-made tanks, with self-propelled artillery to give them the mobility they needed when the invasion started. The U.S., after repatriating the Japanese, concentrated on providing some economic help to Korea. Not a great deal. It was not high on our priority list, unfortunately. But by the time the Soviets finished their work in the north, it was December of 1948, and they withdrew. And that happened to be coincided with the time that the Chinese communists had consolidated their power in North Korea and had driven the nationalist forces out of Manchuria. The U.S. Had not been building an army in the South, but under pressure from the United Nations community, withdrew all of its combat forces in May of 1949. May of 49 is when Mao Zedong had consolidated all of China under his control. The Soviets felt they could afford to leave and did not worry that anything could happen that would need them immediately. We withdrew at a very bad time from the point of view of what else was going on in the area. We left a small MAG, Military Advisory Assistance, a group to help train police forces. We called them a constabulary force, but they were in police. After consultations between Kim Il-sung and Stalin in Moscow, Stalin gave authority for the invasion of South Korea. This is clearly documented now that it was Stalin who gave the final okay, and it had the blessing of Mao Zedong as well. So the invasion took place on the 25th of June 1950, to the surprise of many. It should not have been a surprise because we had agents that came out telling us that the North was preparing for an invasion. They were reinforcing bridges that could only be used to move tanks to the south, and other similar incidents were reported. when the invasion took place, President Truman gave orders to General MacArthur to intervene and to resist the invasion and defend the Republic of Korea and provide all assistance possible to the military forces of the Republic of Korea. And the next day, the United States Air Force, newly created United States Air Force as a separate service, was able to conduct attacks against the North Korean forces to the great relief of the commanders of these newly formed divisions in South Korea. The attacks weren't particularly accurate, I might add, but that didn't cause the South Koreans to lose faith. They were just so delighted that the Americans were finally coming to their aid. MacArthur formed a task force from the occupation forces, flew them into Korea with instructions to stop the North Korean tanks. They had to do this practically with their hands. They had a small bazooka type weapon, a rocket propelled weapon, but it was so small. It was designed and built in World War II for use against smaller, less armored vehicles than those in the possession of the North Koreans. And those troops performed heroically and were eventually reinforced by other units from Japan first. Then a build-up took place in South Korea, and the South Koreans and the Americans were forced to withdraw down to a perimeter in this area of Pusan. All of that was under the control of the North Korean armed forces. Holding that port of Pusan enabled the U.S. to send in more divisions, and those divisions were enable us to hold that key piece of ground until General MacArthur, taking two divisions, a Marine division and an Army division, and sailed around the West Coast, and in one of the truly brilliant military operations, because it was brilliant, because most military commanders would say it's impossible to conduct an amphibious landing when you have the second largest tides on the earth take place on the west coast of Korea. The tides are in excess of 30 feet, and when the tide is out, you literally can look for miles and see nothing but mud flats. And then it rolls in as a big tidal wave, but when it goes out, it's just flowing out. And so you have to conduct your operations in a way to overcome that tidal surge. But that was done, and it enabled the U.S. to put forces into the north of the bulk of the Chinese, the North Korean forces, and with a combination attack out of the bridgehead being held in Pusan, the forces cut off and defeated tens of thousands of the North Koreans. Many of them surrendered. And the forces under MacArthur launched a major offensive which crossed over the 38th parallel and pursued and destroyed the North Koreans. They went clear to the north to include actually getting to the Yalu River on the east, and on the west they went up and were approaching the Yalu River when in December of 1950 the Chinese intervention took place. These Chinese forces attacked, claiming that they were volunteers. They were, in fact, regular forces. They were supported by Soviet regular forces. The Soviets transferred an aviation corps, which included several MiG divisions, flown not by Koreans, but by Soviet pilots. We now have absolute documentation to that effect, something that during the war we suspected. The conversations they carried on were in Russian, but they claimed that those were North Koreans. They were, in fact, Russians or other Soviet forces, but they were regular units, and they did not do well. They lost 9 MiGs to every U.S. Air Force aircraft that they shot down. In fact, that caused an investigation from Moscow, and of course the local commander was not prepared to say that it's because his pilots weren't as good as the U.S. pilots, and they blamed it on the fact that the MiG was not as good as the F-86. Well, it wasn't only F-86s shooting down MiGs. It was all of our aircraft. And the fact is that the aces in the Soviet Air Force became aces because they were shooting down aircraft of the Luftwaffe that were young boys and old men, because all the other pilots had been killed off, and these people that were being shot down and counted as a kill for the Russian or Soviet Air Force were in fact inferior in their training. The introduction of the large numbers, and I'm talking in excess of 300,000 Chinese who attacked the U.S. forces, forced the U.S. to withdraw from the northern area. They withdrew back, moving out of the area in North Korea by sea and coming back in and consolidating, unfortunately, south of Seoul, the capital city, in a defensive line across here. And then when General Ridgway took over in May of 1951, a major counteroffensive was launched. It was very successful, and the combined North Korean and Chinese forces could not stop it. It started moving forward, and it was obvious that it was going to go back to the Yalu River, and that caused the Soviet delegate to the United Nations, Jacob Malik, you may remember him. He suggested that a ceasefire should take place. That's a classic communist activity when they get involved. When they start to lose, they ask for a ceasefire because they know how to take advantage of such conditions. In fact, many of my best friends were killed in various wars during ceasefires. I have some scars myself, as a matter of fact. Ceasefires are only for the U.S. side. We honor such things. The enemy does not, has not, and will not. During this period of the so-called ceasefire, it started in June of 1951 until July of 1953. The forces finally stabilized on the line that you see there. On the east side, it's north of the 38th parallel. On the extreme west, it is slightly south of the 38th parallel. Throughout that time frame, until the armistice was signed on the 27th of July 1953, there was very heavy fighting in many parts of the area as the North attempted to seize critical ground because they believed that there was going to be an armistice, and they wanted to have the best ground, and they would launch major attacks to try to seize a hill that dominated a given area. One of those was an outpost Harry, which I was involved in defending as an infantry battalion commander. I sometimes was released from my special operations duties, and this was one of those in 1953. But for 2 years of the negotiations at Panmunjom, the major issue holding up this thing was voluntary repatriation. That is, the U.S. held out after we were snockered by the Soviets in World War II into returning prisoners who did not want to be returned. We returned civilians who had escaped from the Soviets in World War II. We returned them, and the Soviets did not treat them well. If they weren't killed, they were sent to Siberia. And as a result, we said our principle here, we'll not return any prisoner to a country that he does not want to return to. And this held up the negotiations during this long period of the so-called ceasefire. On the 20th, from the July of 53 until January of 54, the prisoners were processed, and every prisoner was given the option of selecting whether he wanted to stay in the area or go to Taiwan for the Chinese, or return to their native land, either Korea or North Korea or China. And on the 23rd of January, the last ones were released. 23,000, most of them Chinese, were released to go to freedom. And in the case of the Chinese, that was to go to Taiwan. And in the case of the Koreans, they were integrated into the communities of South Korea. Military armistice commission was established to look over incidents, to solve problems immediately, and this met in the Panmunjom on the DMZ all of this time. And from 1953 until I think January of 1967, all through 66, there were practically no incidents that required a meeting of the Military Armistice Commission. But it was starting in January 1967 that the North Koreans recognized that the U.S. was deeply involved in Vietnam, and now was a good time to start creating problems. And believe me, they did. They launched attacks against by sneaking people either by submarine, by fishing boat into the coastal areas of that very long coastline. A few intruders got through the demilitarized zone, and they made, in the course of several years, 5 specific attacks to try to kill the president of South Korea. They, of course, did other things. In 1968, you may remember that they attacked the Pueblo, seized the Pueblo in international waters out in here. There's a ship that was doing electronic surveillance, listening into the area. That ship was captured, and its personnel were imprisoned for approximately 1 year. One man was killed out of the 83-man crew. During this time, while we were heavily involved in Vietnam, the North Koreans started a massive buildup. They doubled the number of divisions that they had, from 20 to 40 plus divisions. They increased the number of tanks by twofold. They tripled the number of artillery weapons, and they moved those weapons into positions just north of that DMZ in attack positions, and they were offensive weapons. This was not discovered until 1975, after we withdrew from Korea. And while we'd been taking photographs of that area from our satellites and other overhead photography, we did not put any analysts on those photos until 1975. And by that time, we found this enormous buildup. And of course, in 76, you recall that the North so brazen as to attack and kill two of our officers in the joint security area, in the demilitarized zone. After attacking the Pueblo, they attacked and shot down, with a loss of 31 Navy personnel, shot down an EC-121. This was a Constellation-type aircraft that was flying, again, in international waters, long distance, 60-some miles away from the North Korean coast, something that we have a right to do and have been doing and continue to do. But it was shot down, and the attacks were continuing against the president, attacking not only in Korea, but when the president of South Korea visited Rangoon, Burma, an effort was made to kill him there. North Koreans who had been placed in Burma and supported by the North Korean embassy in Rangoon. Eventually, the North Koreans decided that they were not going to attend the military Armistice Commission meetings in Panmunjom. They just failed to show up when a meeting was called in February of 1991. They unilaterally withdrew in 1994 and just would not attend because it was just so embarrassing for them. They had been doing so many things so clumsily, so openly, that they did not want to attend and had just refused to use that method of resolving problems. And the problems have continued to get much worse. That is why today, when we try to negotiate with the North Koreans, we have reason to doubt their sincerity. While we have are anxious to solve the problems presented by the fact that the North Koreans now admit that they violated the agreement. It's not an official treaty or agreement because the Clinton administration realized they would never get an agreement or a treaty approved by the Senate. So it was just given a name, an agreed framework. I don't know if you can find a definition of an agreed framework, but I couldn't. It was an agreement that had been reached that the North Koreans would stop their nuclear weapons program and that they would discontinue their efforts to use a nuclear power plant, which was not generating power, but it was converting fuel rods into weapons-grade uranium. Hopefully this is just an interruption in the long-term negotiations. The North Koreans have indicated that they are not going to accept the idea of a dismantling of their nuclear facilities until the United States gives them an assurance that we are not going to attack. Now, we have four major parts of our demands. First of all, we want to get rid of all nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. We have removed ours. We did this many years ago. We have not allowed the South Koreans to produce or to use any of their nuclear generating facilities for the manufacture of weapons, for weapons-grade plutonium. And we are supervising the Japanese. We know that they are not doing this. So there's no chance that anyone but the North Koreans will have the nuclear weapons capability on that peninsula. And our goal, and presumably the goal of all of the forces that participated in the six power talks, and to refresh your memory, the six powers are the United States, Soviet Union, Russia, the Chinese People's Republic, North and South Korea, and Japan. And those six powers met recently in Beijing for 3 days and left without any agreement. That, for those of you who've had the misfortune of trying to negotiate with communists, as I have, that is where you establish your base positions, and the North Koreans and most of the other of our allies have agreed that our stand was pretty strong. As a matter of fact, James Kelly, the Assistant Secretary of State, who is our representative there, is considered less of a hardliner than the man that we have sent previously to these, John Bolton. John Bolton holds a high position in the State Department, but he's one of the few State Department, Foreign Service people who says something and means it. And he is playing the good cop, bad cop role, I suspect, at this time. Even though they think Kelly is bad, Bolton would have been more difficult to deal with. Now, our hardliners want to end up with a failure of the talks, and therefore the next action is to isolate North Korea with the hope that they will collapse. Those who oppose that hardline policy think that there is no alternative to engagement. That is, in talking to them and trying to convince them to it. I think that that is wishful thinking. My personal views are, we certainly don't want to have another conflict on the peninsula, but on the other hand, the potential, the probabilities of having them agree without some major concession, besides that of giving them an assurance we're not going to launch a preemptive strike against them. And the reason that we are not going to launch and are willing to agree that we will not launch a preemptive strike against the nuclear facilities in the north, and Congressman Kurt Weldon took a group of congressmen over several weeks ago, met with some of the North Koreans, and said he understood their problems, and we would perhaps be able to make an agreement that we will not attack you, and sign papers to that effect for 1 year. But during that 1 year, you must demonstrate that you are, in fact, rendering your nuclear facilities unusable. Now, that was not brought up at these last meetings. That's a fallback position we might go to. But the probabilities of North Korea just collapsing without lashing out, if in fact they have a nuclear weapon that is ready, they certainly have the missiles to fire it. And they are at this time holding the U.S., South Korea, and Japan hostage to this threat of firing a nuclear weapon into their very, very dense population. In the vicinity of Seoul, 11 million of the total 40 million people in South Korea live. 11 million people live within 26 miles of the North Korean artillery. And they have the capability of firing their many, many missiles either into Seoul, indiscriminately killing a million people perhaps, or to any of the cities of Japan. They've shocked Japan by firing a two-stage missile from North Korea over Japan out into the Pacific. That got the Japanese attention, and we are going to have troubles in the future with Japan. If we can't settle this with North Korea, Japan is going to want, for defense purposes, not only to get our missile defenses, the best ones we can produce, but they're going to want to develop a nuclear deterrent to threaten North Korea with an attack if we aren't able to disarm them. Another factor that has not been mentioned recently that I think is going to have an impact on future negotiations. Let me just say, I am confident that they're going to meet again. I'm confident of that because the host, the Chinese Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was the host for the meetings in Beijing, issued a statement after the meeting was over that all parties agreed that getting rid of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula is the first priority. And he also said that we're going to meet again. And while the North Koreans said, well, I'm not so sure that we want to meet again. None of the 6 said that they disagreed with that statement, we want to get rid of weapons, including North Korea, made no objections to that part of it. I think that's a sign that they are, in fact, ready to go. But I think that Kurt Weldon's compromise is something that might be brought up. I started to mention that another thing that may cause some heartburn to North Korea is the fact that without a lot of publicity, what's called a PSI, a Proliferation Security Initiative exercise is going to take place in the near future. This is an exercise to find out how we can handle this proliferation. Can we blockade North Korea to the extent that we can control what comes in and out and therefore prevent that? And Australia is joining Japan and the United States and South Korea in this PSI exercise. Now that's obviously aimed at North Korea, and that may make them somewhat unhappy. I don't know that I've established a time to stop, but I think I'll stop now and take questions. Yes.
General, what does North Korea want?
North Korea, we can't tell from what they say what they want. What we believe they want is, and they have said in the past, they want to take over all of the Korean Peninsula as a communist socialist state. That has been the goal of Kim Il-sung. It's been the stated goal of his son, who now rules North Korea. They don't mention that. But that, of course, we realize that they want to get the United States out, because once we leave, our ability to come back in is greatly reduced, and they believe that they would be able to launch an attack by military force, unite all of Korea under communism. That is their stated goal, and it's just goes without saying. They want to do this in steps, and the steps include getting the U.S. out and a non-aggression pact signed by the United States, which they think we would adhere to if we did sign such a thing. Yes, question here.
How do you account for the evolution of a policy of pursuing unconditional surrender of World War II's end to containment in Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War? And how did we go from, why was it that the unconditional surrender was the object of World War II, and then it was just containment for Korea, and then that was what it was for Vietnam afterwards, instead of removing the aggressor regime?
Well, I think our enemies in World War II assumed that we would sue for peace and negotiate the conditions. Roosevelt and Churchill, and certainly backed by Stalin, established an unconditional surrender policy. And that changed a lot of ways in which the enemy looked at it. They fought harder at the time, but in fact, it made it quite clear that they did not have an alternative. And when we unleashed the 2 atomic weapons, they realized that unconditional surrender was better than the alternative. I think that we may have attempted to implement a limited war policy for dealing with the Korean situation, and that ended up in a stalemate that was not particularly attractive to many in our country, but in fact it did stop the killing, it did stop the war, and it produced a great country in South Korea. And the great fear that the North has is that their people will learn how good things are in the South. And that's why they've limited the exchange coming south. They've allowed more people to go from the South to the North, but very few of the North have been allowed to go to the South.
Let's take one more question.
Yes.
How about the South Koreans, what's their attitude? Seem to have an ambivalent attitude.
No, I don't think they're ambivalent. I think they agree that what we must do is to avoid another war. While there are the majority of the population in South Korea now did not go through the Korean War, but they have heard from their grandparents how bad it was, and they have seen some of the evidence of it. And they are constantly reminded of the power in the North by actions taken by the North, who will fly a MiG straight toward Seoul. And as they get, and it's only seconds before they would be over Seoul, they'll turn off and stay in international waters and go back. But it puts Seoul into 11 million people, go into an air raid and go to shelters and the rest of it. So the people in Korea don't want communism, but there is a bigger percentage today who are prepared to compromise on that, saying that would be better than going to war. That's the dilemma they're facing.
Right. Thank you
I
so
am-
much.
Turn it on.
Thank you very much, Jack. I would like to suggest that those of you who have not seen it should get a hold of the extraordinary autobiography that General Singlaub wrote called Hazardous Duty. I read it when it first came out, and I recently reread it. It is a magnificent and interesting book. This man has been involved in all the important things that have been going on militarily in this country and in the world since the early 1940s. And what a great man he is, and people he has rubbed shoulders with, and people whose hackles he has raised, who needed their hackles raising. It's a terrific life story for General Singlaub. And Jack, let me present you as a little token of appreciation, one of the Leadership Institute's Adam Smith neckties.
Oh, I am honored by that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join us on Wednesday, October 1st for our next breakfast. Our special guest will be syndicated columnist Larry Kudlow, who is co-host of the television program Kudlow and Kramer. Any guests who would like a tour should come up to the podium immediately at the conclusion of the breakfast, which is imminent, and you will depart immediately for a tour, and Connie Marshner of our Senior Development Officer will give you the tour. If you were looking for a tour of the building, Connie is your gal this morning. Again, thank you all for coming, and have a nice day.